Hola, hello, Rebeca, hola, bona tarda a tothom, gràcies per venir a la biblioteca. Bueno, a veure, comencem. Et diria que aquesta novel·la, Els grans optimistes, que acaba de sortir, té un cert gruix, no sé si l'haureu llegida encara, però espero que ho feu sortint d'aquí. Seria fàcil dir que és una novel·la sobre la crisi de la sida al Chicago dels anys 80. Això seria com l'evident. Però la veritat és que és més que això. El llibre també conté tota una altra història, una subtrama que es va alternant, que passa a París l'any 2015 i que va sobre una mare que busca una filla, però que en realitat el que fa és d'emmirall de la primera trama de Chicago i amplifica la tragèdia que va passar en aquells anys, l'epidèmia que va provocar un virus desconegut i molt mortífer. A més, una epidèmia que es va veure molt agreujada per la indiferència o directament l'hostilitat del govern i de l'opinió pública del moment, que va considerar que era una malaltia de marginats, drogadictes, gais, etc. Per mi, el gran valor del llibre és que arrisca i planteja la hipòtesi que hi ha èpoques de la història que es fan com de mirall i que connecten i que una mica es repeteixen, que hi ha com una mena d'esprit du temps que es va repetint. I en els moments de grans crisis, de guerres, de grans revolucions, en realitat s'assemblen molt. I, a més, sembla que per donar-li la raó, aquest llibre que allà als Estats Units va sortir el 2018, per tant allà no passava res encara, aquí ha arribat el 2021, i després del que tots sabem, que és una pandèmia, que una mica li fa encara més de mirall, és com una mena de doble joc, i encara l'amplifica més. I moltes coses de les que ella va escriure, evidentment sense pensar, amb un virus nou que arribaria, llegit ara, fa com una impressió molt més forta. Això m'agradarà que després en parlem, de quin efecte pot fer ara aquest llibre que no feia el 2018. No ho sé, potser trobeu que són massa coincidències, però ara ho veurem. Llavors, per començar, Rebeca, m'agradaria preguntar-te una cosa que sembla molt òbvia, que és que ja sé que vius a Chicago, però per què vas triar Chicago i no altres ciutats més òbvies per nosaltres, que serien Nova York o San Francisco, per situar aquesta història?
Right, it's a good question. When we think about the AIDS epidemic, even within the US, we tend to think about cities on the coasts, about New York, San Francisco, maybe Los Angeles. I've lived in Chicago my whole life, and I realized as I began researching this book that I knew the stories of those cities better than I knew the story of my own city. I did not know what had happened in Chicago. And that wasn't the reason I set it there. I had already decided to set the book in Chicago. And partly because I was writing away from my own experience in so many different ways. I'm not a gay man. Although I was alive in the 1980s, I was a child. I didn't live through this directly. I don't have HIV. There were so many different ways that I was writing away from myself. I wanted to look for some ways to keep it very close to me and to my own experience. Setting it in Chicago, in this city that I knew very well, I felt like I could write about Chicago with authority. If I wrote about New York, I'd be making it up, I'd be getting it wrong. And then having chosen to do that, once I began the research, I realized I was learning so much that I had not known about the story of my own city. Everything I learned, whether it was from, I would like to say from a book, but there were no books about AIDS in Chicago. So everything I learned, whether it was from weekly newspapers that I was finding in the archives, gay weekly newspapers, or from the interviews that I did, which was most of my research, I wanted to put so much of that into the book. Of course, I could not put everything in. I could not write a 3,000-page book, but that information became very important for me to share with people.
I una mica perquè la gent tingui una mica més de context, què era i què significava el Boys Town, el barri de Boys Town, als anys 80?
Right, so we're talking about a neighborhood that it was actually, I believe, the first officially recognized gay neighborhood in the US. There certainly were older gay neighborhoods, but this one in Chicago was the first one really officially recognized by the city. And it still is, it's still there. They debated changing the name to something more inclusive than Boys Town. But it was the place where the gay bars were. It was the place where the gay bookstores were. And of course, the gay bookstores, they were in fact bookstores, but they were also meeting places. It was not the way we might think of a bookstore. It was a neighborhood that at the time was a little bit rough. It had been more of an immigrant neighborhood, a little bit cheaper housing, a little bit more crime. Now it has gentrified tremendously. It's very wealthy. It's still largely a gay neighborhood, but plenty of people move there simply because it's beautiful and safe and has wonderful food and shopping. But that certainly was not the case in the 1980s. And living there, you could be more out of the closet than you might be some other places, but certainly not everyone who lived there in the 1980s was out. The bars that I write about, for instance, they would have had their windows painted black or covered with dark cloth. There's still the sense of secrecy everywhere. This is 15 years or so after the Stonewall riot when my book starts, but there was much more sense of freedom than there had been, but there was still a great sense of secrecy for most people.
Ok. I una mica, no tot, esclar, però com era l'opinió pública i la Nord-Amèrica dels anys 80? No? El president era el Reagan, que surt unes quantes vegades que els protagonistes l'odien i li criden a la tele. Ja tens sort que ets una escriptora nord-americana a la qual ningú li fa preguntes sobre Donald Trump. Tens sort, perquè ja no està al poder, però et toca una pregunta sobre Ronald Reagan. Què passava i quina era l'opinió pública sobre els gais o sobre...
Right. America it's a very puritanical country, very conservative in not wanting to talk about sex. Mm-hmm. And because HIV/AIDS, people saw it originally fundamentally as something to do with sex and to do with gay sex, politicians did not want to talk about it at all. Ronald Reagan certainly learned about AIDS when everyone else did in 1981, but he did not say the word AIDS in public until 1987. 6 years into this crisis, he refused to speak about it. I wonder if part of it was that he had been an actor in Hollywood. Mm-hmm. I think he was worried that people would, if he spoke about it, people would wonder if he was gay or point out the friends he still had, like Rock Hudson, who was gay. He wanted nothing to do with it. And he was not alone. Some politicians, when they were asked about it, would actually start giggling and laughing. One of his press secretaries very famously just couldn't stop giggling as he talked about this horrible thing. Other people joked about it, but there certainly was also this awakening going on in the 1980s. Some people very publicly, actors and other people who put it on the main stage and spoke about it quite a lot. And there were also a lot of people just privately realizing what was going on. I'm very interested in the response of my own generation. I was 7 in 1985, the year this book begins. And when I talk to other people right around my age, there's very often a similar feeling that we didn't have an adult's sense of dismissal. We didn't have a sense of crises coming and going. And we didn't have this response of, oh, that's those people over there because of decisions they made. Maybe some people did, but I think for most of us, we were just, our job as children was to absorb the world. And this was one of the things we absorbed. And for me, and I think many other people, we could see the size of the crisis. We could see what was actually happening without all of this politics getting in the way. So there's a generation that grew up with this as a lens through which we will forever see the world. The morality of this time, the politics of this time, the losses of this time became very ingrained in us.
Mm-hmm. I pel que sembla, o pel que jo he llegit, que això és una novel·la absoluta, però evidentment passen coses que novel·litza fets que van passar, hi ha tota una escena molt important d'una gran manifestació. Va haver-hi un moviment molt important a tots els Estats Units, però que a Chicago va tenir molta importància, que va ser ACT UP. Una mica què va ser i per què va ser tan important i què va suposar.
Right. So ACT UP stands for the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. If you've heard of Larry Kramer, who was a playwright who wrote The Normal Heart, he was one of the founders of ACT UP, along with some other people, some of whom are still with us. It started in New York, and other chapters of ACT UP sprang out around the country and also internationally. And I understand that there was or is an ACT UP in Barcelona as well. They were not officially coordinated. They weren't affiliated. There was no president of all of it. But it was grassroots organizations, people coming together to form groups that would protest in the streets, whether it was against the government, in the United States, against certain insurance companies, against the Catholic Church. One of their most famous actions was against St. Patrick's Catholic Church in New York City. They interrupted a mass service. They also they did things that were very dramatic that would get them on TV. There was a very conservative Republican congressman named Jesse Helms, and they wrapped his house in a giant condom. They wrapped latex around his house because he wasn't advocating for sex education and for safe sex. This was to make a statement. They knew how to get on TV. They knew how to embarrass people on the evening news. And one problem that ACT UP faced, along with a lot of these other organizations, was that their leadership kept dying. You'd get someone in charge, and 3 months later they were sick. And then someone else is in charge, and 2 months later they're gone. So these were constantly shifting. There was no time to waste. People had to act very quickly. And so these demonstrations, sometimes they were hastily planned, but they were brilliant in the ideas they had and the way that people worked together.
Okay. I de tot això que expliques, tu dius que tu ets petita als anys 80, te n'has informat amb recerca i entrevistes, em sembla. Però dius que no hi havia gaires llibres ni pel·lícules sobre el sida a Chicago, segur que no. I segurament no gaires. I la teva novel·la als Estats Units s'ha qualificat com la primera gran novel·la sobre la sida. No et crida molt l'atenció que els escriptors americans escriu sobre tot? Com és que no hi havia o no hi ha moltes novel·les sobre això?
I don't think that my novel is, certainly not the first novel about AIDS. I think something that was pointed out in the New York Times when it was reviewed was that it might be the first novel, notably, to cover the long stretch of AIDS. It covers 30 years of time, and I think that's something that has been missing. There are two different issues here. One is, why are there not more books and movies about AIDS itself? And the other issue is, why are there not those books and movies about a place like Chicago? Why are we always telling the same stories about the same cities? I think, originally, if we look back at the 1980s, why was there not this much being said in the moment at the time? Well, partly because everyone was in crisis. At least in the US, the theater world and the world of visual art responded the soonest. It maybe took a little bit less time to make some of those things, those reactions. Photography, and the cover of the Castilian translation here has this Peter Hujar photo. Peter Hujar was a photographer who died of AIDS, and I haven't learned yet about the photograph on the cover of the Catalonian, but I want to. So there was response right away. It only takes a moment to take a photograph. Certainly it takes a long time to develop and choose and frame. But to write a novel can take 6 years, 10 years. If you're sick, if your friends are sick, do you have time to do that? I don't know. There was also, at the time, the question of whether those books would ever be published. Could you sell those books in a bookstore, in a traditional bookstore? Really, you wouldn't. Those books, at best, would be in a little shelf in the corner, LGBTQ literature. more likely, if they got published at all, it would be by a small gay press. They'd be sold only in gay bookstores. So, then what doesn't get published at all? What manuscripts are still in someone's desk drawer and never made it out there? There also certainly, for people who could write about this from direct experience, I think was a great deal of shame and stigma and worry. Many of these men had grown up in the closet and really suppressing their feelings, their sexuality. So when this crisis comes along, all of this trauma, for many of them, they had this muscle memory of how to suppress trauma, how to suppress things that upset you. And for many of them, that was their reaction, was don't talk about it. Try to move on. And don't embarrass, for some of them, it was don't embarrass the community by talking about the worst thing going on. When people look at gay people now, they only think AIDS. They're thinking this in the 1980s, the 1990s. You want to talk about something else. So there are many different reasons why those stories might not be told. In terms of, the stories that we do tell, I think people often want to feel like they're telling the story. So they choose the most obvious setting, the most obvious cast of characters. Unfortunately, that means we're telling the same stories we've heard already. And I think it's much more useful to tell many, many, many stories than to try to tell one story. We need these stories not only about cities like Chicago, but cities like Barcelona, cities everywhere. They each have a very specific story about AIDS back at that time and HIV/AIDS now. But when I went to research, that stuff really wasn't there.
Wow. Val, després de fer aquesta mena d'introducció, perquè us situeu una mica, entrem una mica a la novel·la. I ho farem a través dels personatges. Hi ha dos grans protagonistes. Un és el Yale Tishman, l'altre és una dona, és la Fiona. Comencem per ell. És un treballador d'una galeria d'art universitària i ha d'aconseguir diners, donants, i gent que li doni obres d'art per fer créixer la col·lecció. Coneix una senyora, una anciana, que es diu Nora, que sembla que li ofereix uns dibuixos molt importants dels anys 20, que poden ser de pintors molt importants. Però al mateix temps, la novel·la comença que el Yale se li estan començant a morir tots els amics. I amics molt íntims. La novel·la comença amb un enterrament. No desvetllo res. Parlem una mica de l'amistat i del concepte de cercle d'amics. Per mi és un dels eixos principals del llibre, és l'amistat. Vas voler fer un llibre una mica sobre l'amistat i vas penses que és més important o més duradora que l'amor? O no? Perquè també parla molt de l'amor el llibre, però...
Yeah, I think going into any book about LGBTQ communities, you're going to be writing about chosen family, about groups of friends. It was important to me that I included a lot of biological families in here too, both ones that had fallen apart, rejected people like Yale's, and families that supported their children. We have some examples of that in the book too. We'll talk about in a minute, I'm sure, Yale's friend Fiona, we see her later, and we have a lot of questions about motherhood and biological family. I wanted to ask a lot of questions around that theme of chosen family, biological family, and then the people we choose not in friendship but in love as well, romantic love. Some of the things I wanted to ask were questions about what we owe people and what they owe us simply because we're related, or because we have promised friendship to someone, because we were close at a certain point in time, so are we close then forever? Because we've promised romantic love. And what do we owe the memories of people like that when they have left us? I'm not looking in this book for tidy answers. I'm not looking for one being better than another. And for instance, one of the chosen families in the book is a cult that a young woman disappears into. That is chosen family. It's very negative. So it's hard to look at that and say chosen family is always better than the family you're born into. a lot of contradictory examples and a lot of mess are what let me, as an author, examine that question from many different points of view, and to complicate that question as much as I can, because that's what I see the job of the author being, rather than trying to answer questions, is to take the questions that we already have and make them more complicated.
Yeah, la resposta també. Sí, una de les coses que més m'ha fet pensar és una cosa que ja has dit una mica, que és que com planteges que quan se't moren els amics, o sigui, tu ets el supervivent, quina quantitat de responsabilitat i de pes et cau a sobre com a supervivent, perquè has de carregar tota la vida amb la memòria dels que van morir. I com això et fa portar una vida molt pesada i molt dura per culpa, diguem, dels que han mort. Que això és una cosa que, dit així, no m'havia... però que els hi passa a molts personatges, sobretot a la Fiona. No?
This was something that came up a lot in my interviews, because, of course, by definition, I was talking to the survivors. And it was very interesting to me the way they talked about friends they had lost. There were times, because I was asking them these questions 30 years later, and there were times when they suddenly couldn't remember someone's name and were very upset with themselves for that. Or times people who, on the other hand, practically kept shrines to friends that they had lost. A woman I spoke to who had lost her best friend, she still will send me pictures that she finds of him. She knows I'm done doing my research, but she still wants me to see every picture she finds. And on his birthday, she wants to send me more about him. At one point, I was interviewing someone, and he was talking about a friend of his who died in maybe 1990. And he stopped partway through his story. And he said, I feel very guilty whenever I talk about Danny, because we were very close in our 20s when he died, but I've gone on to have much more meaningful, long-lasting friendships. And I think if he lived, we probably would have drifted apart eventually. But because I was one of the closest people to him when he died, I'm responsible for his memory. But I don't care enough as I probably should, because I've gone on, and this man's now, almost 60, and he's had this life. That was such a complicated emotion for him to express to me. And I realized, when I started writing the book, I was only really writing about the 1980s, and I didn't yet have these sections set 30 years later. But I realized from conversations like that part of my fascination in all of this was memory, the way memory and survivor's guilt and grief function over the long haul. So I knew that I wanted to include that, and I needed to have people looking back as well. Just as I have people in the 1980s looking back to the 1920s, it's something that is always a theme of my work, but seemed particularly important in this book.
I no només l'amistat, sinó també l'amor, perquè la Nora, l'anciana, que és la que va viure al París dels anys 20 i conserva aquestes pintures i va tenir un gran amor, que era un pintor, suposada que ha caigut en l'oblit, però per ella havia de ser un gran pintor. Ella també ella diu que està atrapada en un amor infinit i que per l'amor d'aquest pintor, tota la seva vida no s'ha pogut desenvolupar quasi, o no ha pogut desenvolupar un altre amor, perquè tota la vida li devia alguna cosa en aquest amor. També amb l'amor, que és tan important, encara que tant com amb els morts per malaltia o per...
Right. It's another question that I simply want to ask. I think there's something very complicated about romantic love when you don't part ways. Something else happens. Maybe someone vanishes, one person leaves another, one person dies. It's not the drifting apart that would let people move on necessarily to other things. And I wanted to ask that question about what happens to those emotions when the relationship is gone, when the person is gone. What do you do with that energy? What do you do with that love? And again, I don't have an answer, and I don't think the book has an answer for that either. But just as individual people around us will have different reactions. Another person might move on very easily, but we all know someone who's hung up on the past. When I put characters like that in the book who have very different feelings, different reactions, it's putting together different elements of our world, things that we see around us, and kind of shoving them together into one book to see how they'll react to each other, to see what conversation they might have.
I ara parlem una mica de la Fiona, que és la protagonista una mica de la història més moderna. Què li passa a la Fiona? O sigui, és una persona... No sé si volies escriure sobre les persones que viuen més les vides de les altres persones que no la seva pròpia. Com que posa massa en els altres i no prou en ella? O és algo més complex, suposo, també? Hi ha un moment que dius que li pregunten, quan ella diu, i què havia de contestar ella? Tothom ho deia amb bona intenció. Com podia contestar que aquella ciutat era un cementiri? Que cada dia caminaven per uns carrers on s'havia produït un holocaust, una massacre de negligència i aversió, que quan travessaven una bossa d'aire fred no entenien que allò era un fantasma, un noi que el món havia repudiat. La Fiona tenia dins la mà una pila de fantasmes. Hi ha bastants fantasmes. No n'hi ha, però hi ha la idea que hi ha molts fantasmes a la història. I la Fiona una mica està en contacte amb ells, no?
Yes, she's someone, so Fiona, it's her brother's funeral that starts the book. We know her in 1985 as this young woman, 20 years old or so. And then she's the person we're with every other chapter, much shorter chapters. In 2015 Paris, she's 50 now. And she has a grown daughter, and she's really has not dealt with the traumas of her 20s. I think she does do a lot of living vicariously through other people. She really left her biological family, part of her biological family, to care for her brother, and then to care for his friends once her brother was gone, and grew to define herself that way, as a caretaker, as this beloved sort of little sister figure to this group of men who then vanished on her, disappeared. So again, we have, just like with Nora, this lost love, he's just gone. For Fiona, her personality becomes a caretaker, a sort of a martyr, and then the people she was helping are, many of them, gone, although she continues to live her life working in AIDS activism. This is true to quite a few of the people I met and interviewed, that they really kind of came alive in the 1980s. They came into themselves, discovered their passions, became political, got out in the street. It was, as much as this was a time that was surrounded by death, it was a time of great life for some people. And in the same way that a veteran of a war lives forever in the aftermath of that war, there's the PTSD, but there's also just the sense of, well, that was adrenaline every day, and now what is anything worth? That's really something that she's dealing with. I wanted to really make a very complicated character. It was very important to me because she is really the main straight character in the book. It was very important to me that she not be a savior. She not come in and save the day. I feel like for one thing that's inaccurate, and for another thing it would look like I was saying something that I'm not saying. So I needed her to be a very complex, complicated, conflicted version of that person. So that was what I'm working with there.
No, és complex. Ella està buscant una filla que, per motius que de principi no sabem, diguéssim que s'ha allunyat d'ella i fa molt temps que no sap d'ella i la busca. Té un gran sentiment de culpa, com altres també, així com altres supervivents. Hi ha molta culpa també en el llibre, però també Crec que i també és una idea que travessa tot el llibre, hi ha molt aquesta consciència de la vulnerabilitat, o sigui, hi ha un moment que en parlen també, o sigui, crec que també és un llibre que ens fa pensar molt en que tots som vulnerables, que hi ha un dia que podem morir, que ens pot venir una sentència de mort així, i que llavors tots tenim reaccions diferents. Tens personatges que fugen i se'n volen anar a morir sota el sol, personatges que volen mantenir la vida igual just abans de morir, però una mica tothom es fa més conscient de la seva vulnerabilitat, no?
Yeah, there are many ways in which this is a book about, it is on the one hand a book about characters, it's character-driven personal stories. It's also a book about the big sweep of history. And the way that those two intersect is that I think it's fundamentally a book about the ways that history and the chaos and the brutal randomness of history can sweep in to people's lives as they are living them. And this is true for Nora with the First World War. It's certainly true for these men with the AIDS crisis. And then Fiona is in Paris in 2015. Some things happened there, and which I included only because I was writing it in the fall of 2015, and those things happened. So I put them in the book because it felt like, here we go. This is the kind of thing that happens. My own family life, my father was a refugee from Hungary after the failed revolution. He left Hungary and came to the United States. And I grew up with many of his relatives and friends escaping from Hungary or Romania and living in our basement, surrounded by refugees of Ceausescu or of war. That is a worldview for me. That is an outlook on the world that I think was formed in my childhood, along with my interest and understanding of the AIDS crisis. Certainly, the way that you think you have one life, and something might happen where you have to leave and have a completely different life. Your life might be completely interrupted. I think that's something that I understood from a very young age from everyone around me, and so it's something that makes its way into most of my fiction in one way or another.
Va. Ara parlem una mica no tant del Chicago com de la segona història, que ens porta al París aquest entre guerres, dels anys 20. Què t'interessava d'aquesta època i de el que se'n diu la Lost Generation, o també l'Escola de París, que són tots aquests pintors, tots molt refugiats des d'Europa que van anar a París i van crear un moment d'ebullició creativa molt important. Per què volies escriure sobre aquest moment?
Yeah, that really was my initial impulse, was to write that book. I wanted to write about a woman who'd been this artist model in this time. I've always, who isn't interested in Paris in the 20s, right? That's my previous novel had dealt with my previous novel. It's not translated here in Spain. It's called The 100-Year House, and it goes backwards over the 20th century. We start in 1999 and we go back to 1900, with a lot of time spent in the 1920s. And I had a great time doing research about the American art scene, specifically of 1929. And it was very hard emotionally for me to leave that behind. My next book then was a story collection, but I was still thinking about that time. I didn't want to leave it. So I thought, well, maybe I can write about that again, but maybe a little bit of a different era. Maybe this is Paris, and maybe it's someone looking back on that time rather than being right there. It's tremendously appealing. And I think, as you said, it's another time when people were coming to a city from all over. Those artists were flocking to Paris. In choosing the 19-teens, 1920s, and the 1980s, I was not thinking yet about the parallels between those generations. It was just math. Nora could not have lived much past the 1980s, so my book is going to be set in the 1980s, and then this AIDS storyline takes over. But one of the first things I found in my research, it was, no surprise, much easier to find books about the artists of Paris. endless biographies, right,
Lots.
of whoever. So it was easy to start with that. And one of the first things I found was this quote by F. Scott Fitzgerald talking about his generation and saying we were the great believers. And I found this confusing because this is a generation that we tend to think of as very cynical. What I realized was he was talking about his generation before the war. And I was reading about these artists who came to Paris because it was the age of the art academy. People, including women, could come from all over the world to study painting, really for the first time, the late 1800s into the 1900s. And that generation of young artists, they were coming from all over, they were finding each other, they were finding chosen family, they were very often living in poverty, they were making their art, and then World War I and the influenza of 1918 came through and really decimated that generation, largely of its young men. And the parallels between that, we have to remember it's in the aftermath of all that. That's when we think about the lost generation. That's when Fitzgerald, Hemingway go to Paris, and that's when Gertrude Stein says to Hemingway, you are all a lost generation. And that's how we remember them, right? The parallels in that moment, finding that title and finding the essay that phrase was from, the parallels between that generation and the AIDS generation of a city like Chicago became very, very apparent to me. That in both, in this case too, people were coming to Chicago from all over, chosen family, very often artists, very often making art, very often living in poverty, but finding some happiness until this epidemic comes through. So again, it's the forces of history coming in and disrupting regular human lives. I was drawn to that period simply because who wouldn't be drawn to that period? It's wonderful. But I knew that I had a novel when I saw the parallels between the two eras.
Sí, hi ha un moment en què la Nora li diu en el Yale, no? Li diu, si podem hem de tornar tots al mateix temps. Vosaltres dos, el Nico, el Ranco, el Modi, jo, que són els artistes, tots els que sàpiguen divertir-se. Serà una festa i no deixarem que cap guerra estúpida ens la xafi. No? Com una mica, hi ha un moment com de comunió entre aquests dos personatges que es reconeixen i diuen podríem viure la vida de la mateixa manera, no? O sigui, un noi jove gay i una senyora de 90 anys s'entenen millor que tota la família de la senyora de 90 anys, que l'únic que volen és l'herència.
Yes.
Estan tots allà barallant-se. Llavors, parlem ara una mica, encara que sigui casual, el ressò que el Covid-19 té en aquest llibre, perquè clar, jo l'he llegit ara, i clar, quan jo llegia molt al principi, aquell moment que el Julian i un altre parlen i diuen, t'imagines quina festa quan trobin el remei? I l'altre diu, sí. Clar, tots hem estat un any dient això, tots nosaltres tancats a casa, amb lockdown, i dient, però ja farem una festa quan s'acabi, i tots estem veient que aquesta festa no arribarà mai. No? Perquè ja sembla que no arriba. Estem esperant i no arriba.
Right. Well, I hope, I think that I see that people are finding very different ways of socializing. I'm very interested in, in America, we really never had much of an outdoor cafe, sidewalk cafe scene. Suddenly, I was just in New York City last week, and every restaurant has a little building out, seats outdoors. It's changing culture, I think, in many ways. Maybe, the longer this goes on, the bigger the party will have, maybe, when it's done. But yeah, there are lines like that take on a different meaning for me as well. I wrote this book, it was published in 2018, which means it was finished in 2017, go back to when I was writing it. As an author, you never know what world your book is going to appear into. Many different things might have changed. The election of Donald Trump happened as I was writing this book, and that changed for me quite a few things about the way I was writing. It certainly I had very interesting conversations with the people I was interviewing about, for some of them feeling like, oh my God, all of this was for nothing. We're back to this. For others going, we know how to do this. Okay, plan 7B, we know what to do, right? You just never know. And like I was saying before, the events in Paris in 2015 that made their way into my book was simply something that happened as I was writing. This book then has come out in translation a lot of places last year in Europe, a lot of places this year, and still some to come. And specifically, it came out in Italian, German, French, and Polish right during lockdown. And those countries had a very different relationship to the book. This is a book that, the interviews that I was doing, they were all over Zoom, of course. This is what people were reading alone in their apartments in the middle of a pandemic, really shut inside. As much as you can never predict how your book will be received, I really could not have predicted that, right? Yeah.
Però creus que, que al final el lector és qui realment té l'última paraula en què vol dir un llibre, o que l'autor realment té autoritat? O sigui, aquí hi ha tot un terreny pantanós, no? Però al final, qui creus que té realment la interpretació correcta, diguem, si és que n'hi ha una?
Anytime you have more than one point of view in a novel, which I do here, they're both third person, but Yale's point of view and Fiona's point of view, there has to be a reason for that. It can't just be a writing experiment to try it from two different people. And in some way, the result of that polyphony, the result of those multiple voices, needs to be that the reader ends up knowing more than any of the characters knows. They might know more about life, but we know more about this story than any of the characters does. We've known Yale more intimately. We certainly know things Fiona doesn't know. And when we see things 30 years on, we know things that the characters in the 80s, many of them won't live to find out. And that there is a special position then, right, that the reader is in. I think also the novel ends with two different art shows. There's an art show in the 1980s storyline, although by now it's the 90s, and there's an art show in Paris in 2015. And in both cases, the characters are really taking on the same role that readers are in the novel, looking at the memorialization of something from the outside, but seeing these moments preserved as works of art, as pictures on a wall or as a story in a novel, and figuring out what that means to them. So those two different art show scenes, there were several things I was trying to do with them, but one really is it's a way of finally lifting us out of the story and reminding us that what this book is a memorial to this time, and it is only one picture of that time, and that we are outside of it, and there are other pictures to look at too.
Està clar. Està clar. També un altre sentiment molt compartit amb el moment històric d'ara és aquesta sensació que tots tenim sempre, però que ara la tenim més exagerada, de que no sabíem valorar el que teníem. No? Sovint no sabem valorar el que tenim ara, perquè després serà pitjor, però no ho sabem. No? Hi ha un moment que cap al final que diu he viscut l'edat d'or, Fiona, i no n'era conscient. Fa 6 anys anava amunt i avall, vivia la meva vida, treballava com un negre i no sabia que allò era l'edat d'or. No? Com dient, em pensava que era fatal i allò era boníssim. Què hauries fet si ho haguessis sabut? I diu, el Yale no en tenia ni idea. Com aquesta contradicció, no? Com si que tampoc el coneixement de saber que després anirem pitjor tampoc ens dona l'eina definitiva de saber què fer amb el que hem de fer cada dia, no?
Right. Yeah, it's, there is that paradox. If I feel like this is my last chance to do anything, I will, does it ruin that moment, right? You're no longer just living innocently. If you feel like this is your last chance to enjoy something, there's too much pressure. But I think that's so often the way it is. You realize what the best times were so often only afterwards. And we see, at a time like this, we see all these things that we took for granted, hugging someone, going to a concert indoors, that we had no reason to really be appreciating, and hopefully we'll appreciate again because we'll get through this and and then we'll be telling our, grandchildren or the children now will be telling their grandchildren how hard it was, and they won't care and they won't understand until something happens to them, right? Yeah, exactly. But that is something that I heard from people I was interviewing, this idea that there was this window between Stonewall in New York and the onset of AIDS that felt really like tremendously festive. And it felt for a lot of people who were out of the closet and living, in a place where they could be accepted, it felt like the future. And then, now again, we're in an even better place, certainly with gay rights than we were, but there was just such a giant step backwards for so long.
Sí, també aquí. Per acabar, volia preguntar sobre el títol, que almenys per acabar una nota més optimista. Ja has vist que la traducció, encara que siguin una mica diferents, hem hagut de fer, hem dit els optimistes, perquè suposo que believers, creients, aquí tenia un significat que no era adequat, perquè sembla només com creient religiós. Hi ha un moment que parles de l'optimisme, no? I que dius, per què l'hem de continuar tenint si sabem que hi ha tragèdies terribles, no? Però hi ha un personatge que diu, no, s'ha de ser optimista perquè els optimistes som els que continuem igualment tenint fe, no? En què alguna cosa, en què val la pena, la lluita, almenys.
I agree, and I really like the translation. They've used something similar in French and German as well. I think it does some of the same things that the Great Believers does. I have learned, in English, Believers doesn't necessarily have a religious connotation, but it seems like most other languages it does. I think in both the English and in these translations, I think the title is doing something similar of asking, stating that these people, are very hopeful, but also in saying that, inviting us to think about what might go wrong for them at the same time. There's also the question of, to what extent does their optimism help them? To what extent does that belief, they have hope even in the darkest times, that's great. But to what extent also are they too credulous sometimes? Yale is tremendously naive quite often, to his detriment. And so I don't mean this to be, these are optimists and it's great and everyone should be an optimist. It's more, a question, once again, of what do we believe in for better or worse? It's funny, the American cover, they gave the title very kind of serifed, nice big font, and then it's these sort of golden beams of light, maybe stretching across. And I keep joking that I'm trying to trick people into thinking it's a religious text, like a big hymnal or something. So your religious great aunt will pick it up and accidentally read a book about AIDS. I don't know. I don't know if that will work or not.
Bueno, potser funciona, ha funcionat, no? Allà. No sé si algú vol fer alguna pregunta. Sí, mira, allà hi ha algú. Espera, que em sembla que et porten el micro.
Thanks. Hi, Rebecca. Congratulations on the book. I thought it was fantastic. There's so much in it, and yet it never feels dense or heavy or hard to read. It's actually, I couldn't put it down. I thought it was unbelievable.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask you about the character of Yale. is Yale based on anyone in particular, or did Yale just come to life in your imagination?
That's a great question. On the one hand, I will say no, all my characters are come from I don't know where, they're amalgams. I specifically in this book, I did not want to I wanted to be able to interview people without them fearing that I would base a character on them or on their friends. So I really developed my characters before I did my interviewing and got to know people. There are elements of Yale that are very close to me. I gave him asthma, and that plays a role later in the book in a way that I felt I felt competent describing, if that makes sense. I'll be careful here, but what happens to him later is something similar has happened to me, and I could describe that with confidence. But here's what I'll say: there was this one activist in Chicago whom a lot of different people kept telling me about. And he seemed to had a very big personality. And I had already really imagined Yale visually and, in every other way. And I kept hearing about this one young man who died in 1991. And then someone showed me his picture. And I swear to God, it was a picture of Yale that I had in my head. It looked exactly like I'd pictured him. And there were certain things that then kept happening, that coincidences that I would find out between my character and this person. I said to a close friend of this man, I said, I think he might be haunting me. And she said, oh, he definitely would do that. But thank you so much for your comment and your question.
Allà també. Allà. No ho veu. Allà n'hi ha una,
Perdó.
Perdó.
M'ha vist abans.
No t'havia vist.
No, jo volia preguntar, primer, gràcies i enhorabona a les dues editorials per treure un llibre tan valent i que tinc moltes ganes de llegir-lo i acostar-nos als lectors. I li volia preguntar a l'autora perquè ha parlat del procés de recerca, les entrevistes que havia fet, a l'hora de conèixer gent que va viure aquella època. I mentre xerrava se m'ha acudit pensar, donat que el llibre dels Estats Units havia sortit feia uns anys, si s'ha trobat amb gent que s'hagi posat en contacte amb ella, que bé en un principi hagués dit no vull participar en aquest llibre, o que no coneguessin o no... I llavors que s'haguessin posat en contacte amb ella després de llegir el llibre i haguessin explicat alguna història molt similar a algun dels personatges o diferent que, vist ara amb el temps, li hagués agradat incloure com a personatge propi. Gràcies.
That's a great question. I've heard from many, many people, and it's been most gratifying to hear from the people I was most nervous about reading the book, which is men who lived through this in Chicago at this time. They've been my most vocal supporters. These are the people who come up to me at a reading and want to hug me or show me pictures. And that's wonderful. I have heard a lot of additional stories. In some ways, I'm grateful not to hear them until now because I was already hearing so much more than I could use. It was so tempting to write a 2,000-page novel, and no one needs that. So there are times when I hear an amazing story and I think, wow, that's a great story. I'm so glad that I'm only hearing it now because it would have killed me to hear it before and not include it. I'll tell you, I have this very... It's not a strange category, but a notable category of emails that I get is, I call these the uncle emails. I have dozens of emails that will be from someone younger than me, usually a young woman, sometimes a young man, saying, I had an uncle who I really adored, and he died of AIDS. And then it sometimes goes into, my parents never wanted to talk about it and they never mentioned it again. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's, my mother loved him dearly and goes in that direction. And then it usually is something like, I never really understood what he lived through. Sometimes he lived in Chicago, and I didn't know anything about his life, but reading this book gave me a sense of what his life might have been like. And then I believe there are 5 of them now, I'm keeping track, where this person said, so I found his former partner and emailed, and we are having lunch for the first time. Sometimes someone that had been, the family had completely shut out. And this person, after reading the book, has now found this deceased uncle's partner and connected with them. It is any one of those just bowls me over. It is stunning to me that there have been that many that say something that similar. But I think that role of uncle was very, very important to a lot of these young men, especially at a time when really it wasn't likely for them to have children. And for these young children looking up to this wonderful uncle who was suddenly gone and never understanding what happened, finding a way to figure that out. So that's a whole other novel. There's no room for that uncle story, for instance, in this novel, but it amazes me when I get those emails.
Hi, I've not read the book yet, but I can't wait. It sounds amazing and really well documented. And you said at the start that you had to find ways to make the story kind of more close to you because you were not a gay man or etc. And so I thought, what was the reason that brought you to write about HIV/AIDS? What was the motivation behind that? Did it come from like years before, or was it when you thought of writing a novel and finding a subject to write about?
Yeah, this is something I have been interested in writing about for a long time. I had a short story in my story collection, which was my previous book, that was about AIDS in the art scene in New York City. It's something that, like I was saying, I think just generationally, really struck me as a child, really was, one of the ways I learned to see the world very early on. As a writer in a major city, I have many, many, many gay friends. And so it's something that, although I'm not a member of that community, it doesn't feel terribly far away from me. It's not like writing about people that I really don't know or haven't met. I've actually always found it much easier to write gay men than straight men. I don't understand the way straight men think at all. I have them scratch themselves, although I don't know what to do with them. Gay men as characters, I identify with much more. I find it much easier to write them. So it's a huge risk, and they're when you write fiction, you are always going to be writing away from yourself in multiple ways. Sometimes, if nothing else, just gender. If you are a woman, it's unlikely that you're going to fill a novel only with women. If you are a certain age, it's unlikely that you're going to fill a novel with people only your age, only your education level, only live where you live. Certain chasms that we leap over are wider than others, of course, and certain ones are more fraught, more difficult to imagine life from elsewhere, especially when you're talking about a viewpoint that has been less represented in popular culture and in the world. So there was a lot of risk in doing this. There was risk for me, sure, but more importantly, there was risk in getting it wrong. I didn't want to do harm in the world by getting things wrong. And I didn't want to take a spot from someone who could tell a story more directly. The way that book publishing works is that when a book like this is successful, it means more books like this get published. So I could answer fairly easily that question. I didn't feel like publishing this meant the publisher is now going to say no to someone else. It actually makes it more likely that they'll get published. But there was this very healthy sense of terror that I had, that I needed to get it right. I could not go into this with any sense of hubris, any sense of assumption. I couldn't guess what I thought it might have been like. I really had to do that work. But why I was drawn to it, I'm not entirely sure. I'm never entirely sure what draws me to something. It's kind of like when you wake up from a dream, if you're someone who remembers your dreams, and sometimes you can say, well, I think I dreamed that because I was just talking to that guy and I'm worried about my thing next week. But where did the toaster oven come from? What was that? Why is there a toaster oven in my dream? Sometimes things they're there in your subconscious. They're there as subjects for you. So I don't know if that answers your question or not, but I appreciate it.
Alguna més? Allà.
Hi, Rebecca. I haven't read your book yet, but I'm really looking forward to it. I really like the way you talk about this. I wanted to ask you, because I recently watched a series like Pose and It's a Sin, which are based in New York City and London, respectively. I wanted to ask you, how do you think that your story, which is based in Chicago, differ, if it does at all, from these other stories? Thanks.
Thank you. It's a good question. I partly can't answer it because for several reasons, I've avoided those shows. It has not. I understand that they're great, and I'm excited to see them. But because we were talking about making this book into a show, I wanted to sort of stay away from what was out there already. I will say that my understanding, at least of It's a Sin, is that it's telling a story that is very, very specifically about AIDS. And that is one approach. This book is about many, many different things. The AIDS epidemic is one of them, but as you've heard, it's also about cults and the art world and Paris and all these other elements as well, which is a choice on my part. I certainly could have written the book that was much more focused in on this timeline of AIDS, but I wanted a book that had the texture of real life. And, you make a different choice regarding that with every project. In other novels that I write, might be much more focused on one certain sequence of events. So there's that, and there's also the fact that simply it is the story of Chicago. And when I've been traveling for this book, in the US and abroad, it's been fascinating to me wherever I go to learn the local history of HIV/AIDS and the ongoing history of HIV/AIDS in that place. Some small cities in the US where you would not think that there had been a big history, but in some cases, I was in a small city in Iowa, and what I learned when I was there was that if you were a young gay man in Iowa in the 80s, you probably left and went to Chicago or Minneapolis. But a lot of those young men, when they got sick, they came home. And so the doctor, I met the doctor there who dealt with all of this, all in a vacuum in this small city. No LGBTQ community doing grassroots stuff, no other doctors who were his peers. That city has such a specific story that is entirely different from the one I'm telling, that's entirely different from It's a Sin or Angels in America. It's yet another reason why we need a plurality of stories. We need more and more of these books. When we only have a few, we start to think that this is the story. And you start to get a stereotype of exactly who this affected and when and how. We need enough stories that people don't feel the responsibility in sitting down to write it to represent the story. Because if you feel like you're the only one telling this story, you feel like you have to tell the most general story or the most common story, when in fact would be better served by hearing the outlying stories in some cases. So I get asked sometimes in interviews what I think about this huge wave of AIDS literature, and what people mean is like the 4 or 5 books in the past 10 years. I'll ask them to think about, how many novels do you know about the Civil War in America? How many novels do you know about World War II? And, think about how many shows how many novels you know about AIDS, 45 million people have died globally of AIDS. We still have close to 1 million people dying globally of AIDS every year. Where are those books? So I would say, I'm glad for any differences in what's coming out there, because we need, if we only have a few stories right now, we can't afford to be telling the same story again and again. So I'm excited. I'm very excited for things to be on television, to be watched broadly. Several documentaries a few years ago, BPM from France was a very important one, that are letting a younger generation, I think, in on what had happened.
No sé si n'hi ha més. No? Crec que no. Bueno, pues per mi ja estaríem. Gràcies, Rebeca, per estar aquí amb nosaltres.
Absolutely, thank you. And I would love to thank my publishers and the wonderful interpreter back there. And thank you for doing this. No. And I will be out signing books. And I'd love
Ara
to
estaré aquí signant exemplars per qui en vulgui. Gràcies.